With me is Louis Castonguay. He is a psychotherapist, teacher, and researcher at Penn State University, and is best known for his work on psychotherapy integration within a CBT framework, and also very influential for his research on the principles of change. So, thanks so much for having us, Louis.
Thank you.
So, in your youth, you described yourself, you went through being a Freudian to a Rogerian to a Skinnerian, and nowadays you're a cognitive behaviorist thinking integratively. So, could you briefly tell us how you came from this confusion of the early years to now the complexity you are now?
Well, I must say that when I became a CBT, in a way, it was being influenced by the environment that I was in as an undergrad and as my first master thesis that I did in the University of Montreal many years ago. This was right in the beginning of the 80s, and so the work of Goldfried, Beck, Mike Mahoney, Mike and Bond were really, really exciting and stimulating. That was so new. People were moving away from a purely Skinnerian perspective. There was a hope in some ways that this movement would be a form of integrations because it was walking into the territory of the psychodynamic and the humanistic orientations by recognizing the importance of meaning that people add. So that was really exciting. But when I really got into as a cognitive behavior therapist is when I went to Stony Brook to study with Marv Goldfried. Stony Brook was at the time really kind of like a pillar. I remember that many of the president of ABCT at the time was AABT were either former graduate from Stony Brook or faculty members. So in the beginning, I was kind of reluctant to really do mostly or only CBT when I was supervised by a faculty member at Stony Brook, but it really allowed me to see what I consider the two most major contributions of CBT. One, it's really allowed us great skills to reduce the stress of the individual, great tools to actually also to kind of decrease their impairment. And what it also does, it does also fantastic tools to provide coping skills that the person might be using. So kind of addressing, facing fears, things that the person did not feel they were going to be able to do, decreasing behavior that would otherwise create some problems. So these were the two major things. And then, to answer your questions, the complexity, well, I would say that I actually absolutely adore to do cognitive behavior therapy by the book. I love to kind of if I could for all my clients, just kind of follow the treatment manual of the CBT, I would. There's something just wonderful when you actually see somebody decrease their BDI or whatever outcome measure that you're using by you kind of helping him or her to have a new perspective of self. It's just wonderful to do that, have the person being more activated. But the problem is that for some people, irrespective of the clinical problem, whether it's an eating disorder, whether it is a depression, just focusing on problem skills will not, or straightforwardly focusing on coping skill will not allow them to develop them. So that's when I kind of reopened myself to, okay, well, what are some of the orientation to deal with alliance rupture, to deal with resistance, to deal with transference?
Mm-hmm.
And, these phenomena that I saw just made me thought, okay, I still want to aim for the two major goals of CBT that I see, but when I cannot just use the principles that they actually are based on, then I'm going to reopen myself. And the major task that I find is, how do you do that in a way that is cohesive?
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't want to actually one session do CBT, the next one to do a two-chair or the next one to focus on existential issues just because the person comes in and say, well, today I'm questioning whether I'm doing a right career. I want to be able to do more than just shifting from one technique to other. And I think that the best way to do that is to be cognizant of what are you trying to actually do? How are you guided conceptually by the things that you are doing? How is your case formulations and treatment plan are tied to a view of human beings that are influenced by different paradigms and a repertoire of interventions that are complementary, but that will really aim at your goals.
Yeah. What you're saying, taking from what you're saying, you touch on a spot that I think is very interesting, which is this is a Wes Greenberg distinction between the following and leading the client, I mean.
Yes.
And what you said about the need for structure and cohesiveness, I would like to see how you can how can you manage the dialectic between that structure and the need to be flexible to the patient's needs. How do you feel, how can you integrate this in a way?
It's a great question. And of course, it's always a major dialectic. Leading versus following. One that people have been talking about that in some ways is very similar to that, which is an issue, how much are you guided by your plan when you're doing the intervention, and how much are you guided by what is taking place in the moment to moment in the sessions. The way that I try to, whether or not I'm successful to deal with this, is that in my understanding of the case and in my plan for the treatment, I'm kind of fairly global. So I'm fairly kind of global. I really like the heuristics of 𝗵cie𝘀𝘁 of the 5 major principles of change. You increase hope and expectations. You establish a good alliance. You really help the person to acquire a new perspective of self. You help the person have positive experience that he or she did not think they could. And then you basically want to generalize what's happened in therapy with outside it. And in some ways, I kind of like presenting something like this to clients. I like presenting a general perspective. I would like you to, at the end of the therapy, to be better at handling the things that you want to handle. I would like you to be less harsh toward yourself. So by presenting that in a kind of both in terms of the global view of my principle of change, my global view of what I see as source of pathology or maintenance the problem, then I think in some ways I can navigate and I can actually spend more time working. So for example, last client that I saw, last session that I did, I basically spend the sessions, even though, she's a returning client. She's somebody who, we worked for a number of years, and a difficulty with her husband, and she's a difficult client. We worked for a number of years. Now she's coming back because she has been maintaining her contact with her psychiatrist to maintain the medications. And she's coming back, she's saying, my psychiatrist thinks that I should see you again because you kind of really helped me to decrease my stress. And basically what was worrying her is that she was drinking more than she wanted to. She's a born-again Christian, and she feels like she should not be drinking at all. And then we agreed. Okay, what we want to do is we really want to decrease the stress. The medication is not enough. The situation that she's in is a very, very stressful one. And the goal to me was, all right, what I'm going to try to do is replace her current coping skills, which is to drink. She's still very, very functional, but she doesn't want to drink every night, 1 glass of liquor, by other strategy. But it became very, very clear that I had an opportunity at the last sessions to actually help her to make an insight about how she was seeing the relationship that she has with God. The relationship she had with God was that she's obeying him. She needs to do that. And I was saying, yeah, but there's some reciprocity, right? So you need God, but in order for you to do the task that she's doing now, which is really, really complicated, she's taking over the parenthood of her child who has difficulties. So she's basically is the mother instead of being a grandmother late in her life. And basically what I was saying is like what you're doing here is God is also helping you and you're developing a relationship. I want you to become aware that you are developing a relationship, a dual relationship with God here. And she then jumped in and she says, absolutely, this is called synergy. This is at the center of my faith. This is what we're talking about. The insight she made was, and for the first time, she said, Dr. Castonguay, today you were really good.
Positive feedback.
After years and years, this is the first positive reinforcement. And so, in a way, if that fits cognitive therapy, in a sense, like but it was not like a cognitive restructuring, like was Socratic dialogue. It was more an evocative, more deepening, but I was clearly following what I wanted to do, which is my goal is I actually want you to decrease your stress and replace your coping strategy by another one. And here, by making an insight that really allowed her to touch spiritual and existential issues, really kind of, I think, decreased her. So I kept saying to her every night, when you are confronted with that stress, think about what you're doing. You are actually getting into this relationship with God. He's helping you, but you're helping him taking care of this little girl that without you would have a different life, right? So it's this kind of general perspective that allowed me to actually then be consistent, even though I shift, because I have to say that when I was doing these interventions, when I was focusing on insight, I was much less directive than I typically am. I was much more slow in terms of helping her to kind of approach the subjects. In other words, I was less controlling. I was less directive. I was much more acting as I felt. And it was a conscious choice. I want to be more Rogerian rather than Beckian here. I want to really kind of helping her to get to a place where the emotions will be deep, the connections will be deep. So it's much less a Socratic dialogue and much more helping her to kind of really developing a new sense of self.
Okay, here you already gave us quite a couple of clues about how you work, and you seem to have quite a, in that sensitivity, I would say pragmatism. You have an explicit goal, and whatever the course you take, you have that goal defined in a way. I was struck by how you talked about what I would call the down-regulating of emotion. So you constantly have this objective also of being able to down-regulate emotion, which actually leads us to another interesting discussion, which is the importance of heightening emotion.
Yep.
So I know your mentor, 𝗵cie𝘀𝗁 was quite an eloquent CBT practitioner, so he always gave importance to this. And so I would like to ask you concerning this, for you to talk a little bit to us about two major influences I think you had and how they contributed for you to go beyond the traditional CBT framework. And these two figures I would like you to speak about would be Goldfried, how he helped you in that, and 𝗵cie𝘀𝗁𝗍.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep. Well, Goldfried, I mean, it's a really an influence that dated many years. I was completing my master thesis, which was a conceptual one at University of Montreal, and I was doing a literature review on common factors in psychotherapy, and I had already written something like 200 pages, and I wanted to kind of having the last chapter. In the last chapter, I wanted to kind of create a model. I wanted to do two things with my last chapter. I wanted to kind of create a model that will bring all of the common factors that I have identified. And there was something that was missing in the model, something that was missing in terms like I couldn't put exactly my figure on it, but there was something more global than just specific variables like operating conditioning, having a rational, like those specific little factor. I thought, yeah, this is all important, but there is something more that is not only the relationship, that is more at the intervention level, but it's more than just a little technique like everybody's using relaxations. And so that's a specific technique. But I thought, well, but there must be something, there must be, in other words, common factors that are not only relational, like establishing a relationship, and they are technical, but they are not something very, very specific in terms of specific technique. So that was the first. Yeah, I was like, kind of like, there must be something bigger. And then the other thing is like, well, my master thesis is essentially a step, before that to do more research now that I did the theory. So and I was thinking like, what would be some of the best place to do research? And 𝗔𝗹𝗲𝘅 had pointed me to the work of Gottfried, says, well, you want to pay attention to this. And I remember telling him, yeah, but, he's a cognitive behavior therapist. What does he have to do with psychotherapy integration? And he was saying, well, interestingly, he's starting to form an association about psychotherapy integration, and you should be reading, some of the stuff that he has been publishing about common factors from a principle of change. And I remember going to the American Psychological Associations. At the time, people would go there to buy books. There were big book display there that you can actually find those really rare books. If you were not American, if you were Canadian, you could go to APA essentially to buy books. And I remember buying a book that he actually had published in 1982, Converging Themes. And I read his his chapter in this book, and I was basically dancing in my room at my hotel. It was just before I was completing, and basically he was talking about principle of change. So kind of like a general strategy of intervention that is in between technique and theory. And I thought, wow, this is completing my model, and this is what I want to do for my research. So this is how I became really influenced by him. And then I really wanted to do my PhD at Stony Brook. And by the way, I was convinced that my GREs would be too low. So I invited him to come to Montreal to present a talk. And then he made sure that I got into Stony Brook, despite the fact that I probably have the lowest GRE score of the United States that speak English then. So that's how it started. And then we we did research together. And one of the things that was wonderful with Marv was that he was really, at the time, he had got a big grant from NIMH to look at one of the principles of change that he was working on, which was, how do you help people to develop a new perspective of self? As I was doing with my clients last week, So it's not only that you're obeying God here, you're getting into a relationship with him to help him to do what he thinks is important for you to do. So that's what was his focus. But I was also very interested in other principles of change, like the Working Alliance. I thought this was the way to go. This was in the 80s. People were starting to kind of showing that there was some scales that could actually be very important, not only empirically, but epistemologically. For me, I never got over Freud. I was always a big Freudian fan, and I was convinced that there was something wrong when people were saying that Freud was not testable, that Freud was not scientific because you could not falsify his theory. And I thought that with the scales of alliance, either the CALPAS or the WAI that came later, I thought, oh my God, here it is. We have a measure here that can be reliable and can be valid and can lead us to test some hypotheses. Therefore, it can actually show that epistemologically, people are wrong to think that Freud cannot be tested. So that was one of the reasons I thought, oh my God, this is so fantastic. And in addition, those instruments were also allowing me to get back to my love for Rogers, because really talking about the therapeutic relationship.
Mhm.
So to his credit, Marv allowed me,
Mhm.
gave me the permissions in my dissertations to study the principle of change that he was interested in, how you acquire a new perspective of self. And he also said to me, well, I don't think that you will be able to measure reliably the alliance by using an observer measure, because we were working with a data set that was an archival data set. There was no measure of alliance. And he was saying, I think that a therapeutic relationship cannot be measured from an observer perspective, but hey, it's your dissertation, try it.
Mhm.
And so I did my dissertations, and what I found was that, well, the working alliance, we could code it reliably, and it was positively related to outcome, not only when measured by the client,
Mhm.
like the PDI, but also by an observer measure,
Mhm. Mhm.
the Hamilton. And I thought, oh my God, here it is. We can actually, this might have been the first study, one of the earliest study about cognitive therapy for depression. But what I also found in my dissertation was that the therapist focus on the cognitive model and the technique as measured by the scale that Marv had created in order to measure the client's acquiring a new perspective of self, that it was related to outcome, but negatively so.
Mhm.
More, the therapists were doing what they were supposed to do, less there was change. So this is where I'm coming with 𝗔𝗹𝗲𝗅 stuff, with your questions, because then what I did is I did content analysis, which is a very nice term to say that I read the transcript. And I read the transcript where the alliance was high and the technique was high,
Mhm.
and the sessions where the alliance was low and the technique was high. And in the first, high alliance, high technique, what
Right.
you saw is the way that I would love to do cognitive behavior therapy. The therapist was doing stuff, the client jumped into it, the clients was agreeing, they were disagreeing about the content, but they were agreeing on, yes, let's challenge that. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Good alliance, very strong, explicit technique. In the other, my hypothesis is that the therapist is so rigid in terms of the technique that he or she is using that there is a relationship problem and the therapist does not see it.
Mhm.
And I was completely wrong. Because what you would see in those sessions, now those are qualitative analysis, you got to be careful, and not as systematic as task analysis. This was more content driven.
Mhm.
There would be a lot of markers of alliance problem. The client would say, no, I don't want to do this. No, I don't think. And what the therapist was doing, the therapist was actually trying to convince the client that this needed to do.
Yeah.
So the client would say, I don't want to do that. I don't think it's relevant. And then the therapist would say, no, I think it is relevant.
Yeah.
You don't get it. The research is, we're doing that nicely, but the research is telling us, and by the way, you used that before and it worked. And what actually was taking place, it was more like an issue of they got in the struggle, right? Yeah. It was not the technique per se, is when it was used and for what purpose it was used. In fact, statistically, what we did is we looked at the correlations between the therapist's focus on the client's on the cognitive therapy model and outcome. And once we control for the alliance, that relationship stopped to be significant. So it was the context that was the most relevant. And when I was reading that, I was thinking like, oh my God, the problem is not the use of the technique, is they don't repair the problem that is created by. So at the time, we're talking now 1992, when I was doing that, well, Jeremy just came with this amazing paper in psychotherapy with a number of authors, well-known authors now, and about how to work with therapeutic alliance. Mm-hmm. I had been a big fan of Jeremy for years, but more about his general view of psychopathology and treatment, like the importance of recognizing of using emotions as an important aspect of cognition. So the great book that he wrote with Les Greenberg about emotions, he was also recognizing the importance of, he published this amazing book in 1990 with 𝗔𝗹𝗲𝗅 about
interpersonal processes.
right, not only the emotions, but also the development and the interpersonal. And I was a big fan.
Yeah.
But then I thought, wow, he's also talking about the working alliance, something a little bit more focused. And that is directly, I think, addressing that. So then in some ways, I was directly influenced by this. So the first study that I conducted here at Penn State as a junior faculty member was I compare cognitive therapy, the more traditional one, with cognitive therapy except when there's an alliance rupture. And then when they were an alliance rupture, then what the therapists had to do, they were graduate students, they had to shift gears and use the technique that Jeremy, but also other people like David Burns were saying. Repairing the alliance rupture, you first need to recognize there's a problem here. Then you help the clients to talk about how difficult it's been for him or her to be in these situations and how difficult it is to talk about what's going on, and then to find a way to recognize how you are, as a therapist, partly responsible for this. And then that helped the client. Then, Roger had this beautiful expression, which was, openness to our experience leads to the other openness to the experience. So if the therapist is saying, I think part of the problem is me, frequently the client will say, yeah, it is, but I'm also part of that. And then when they did that, then they have to move back to cognitive therapy. And then the result of that study was interesting, was promising. Then Mike Constantino did the research that actually compared cognitive therapy with that integrative form of therapy. 2 studies, small n, but they are pointing out that it is, that's promising. And then also influenced by the work of Marv and Jeremy, then colleagues of mine, Tom Borkovic, Michelle Newman, and myself, did this big, huge treatment study for GAD where we compare cognitive behavior therapy that Tom Borkovic had developed with an integrative form of treatment that basically was based. It was an implementation of Jeremy's and 𝗔𝗹𝗲𝗅 interpersonal book that you mentioned, that we actually added to the cognitive behavior therapy. And the findings that we have so far are, if you just compare traditional cognitive behavior therapy with a cognitive behavior therapy that also integrates psychodynamic and humanistic interventions to address developmental, emotional, interpersonal problems. If you just compare them, there's no difference. But if you actually start looking at some specific type of client, then it makes a difference.
So it's differential. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have a GCCP paper that shows there's no differences. Michelle Newman is the first author. And then there's a new GCCP paper that actually also by Michelle as a first author that shows that for people who are more dismissive in terms of their attachment, they have a difficulty of establishing a therapeutic relationship. They're more in their head. They're away from emotions. When these people are receiving, in addition to cognitive therapy, technique that foster emotional experience, that help the persons to deal with what's going on interpersonally, including alliance rupture, they benefit more from this integrative treatment than a traditional CBT. A kind of a way of saying integrative treatments are good, but it's not a panacea. It's not like we should stop doing psychodynamic or cognitive behavioral. A better way to think about it is that sometimes our model are not sufficient, and sometimes for some clients we might want to integrate aspects that come from other orientations.
From what you're saying, my instant feeling is you're talking about responsiveness, basically.
I think so.
Yeah, that when something doesn't work, we have to do something different in a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, the big dilemma here from a clinical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So here, this was an experimental design. So the therapist had no choice, right? So they were applying a treatment protocol. We were not saying to them, well, if you are working with somebody who has an attachment issue, you should be using that, right? This was analysis that was done later.
Yeah.
But I think it does tell us now, this is informative because it says if you're working with somebody who has GED, and if the person has a problem of dismissiveness, well, at least for once, based on one study, CBT might not be enough. And then you might want to be responsive. But of course, one of the big issue, I think, in psychotherapy is when do you stuck with one orientations and when do you actually start doing something else? Because as we all know, sometimes clients will have resistance, right? Sometimes people you will want to actually have the person to be exposing himself or herself to the thing that they are afraid, and they may say no.
So when to insist and when to change?
When to insist, because part of that resistance can actually be the problem.
A great question, yeah.
Right? It's kind of like, at this point, no, move it. Just move it. And at what point do you say, well, this is above and beyond a learning principle? Maybe it's my way of trying to convince the person, which, by the way, interestingly, this was also something that Marv Goldfried and Jerry Davidson were pointing out very, very, very early in the 70s. Davidson actually had a beautiful paper where he was saying, when there is a problem in the therapeutic relationship, in the therapy, they were not talking about therapeutic relationship yet. When there is a problem in the therapy, the first place you should look at is the therapist. Which, in a way, that was a revolution from the way that traditional psychodynamic treatment was used. If there's a problem, well, it's resistance. Davidson was saying, no. The first problem might be either you have the wrong case formulations or the way you're using it is inappropriate, and therefore you should take a distance.
Yeah.
And in that sense, what Jeremy had done is it gave up directions. Where are the place to look at? Well, one of the place to look at is it's the alliance.
Yeah.
Might not be the only one, but the other place is, well, maybe the way you're presenting it, or maybe the rhythm that you're using might not be attuned to the client needs. So
you're bridging there. Sorry, you're bridging there with something that I wanted to ask you, because you're also talking a little bit about patient characteristics, personal characteristics that come into play. So beyond the model, etc. So I'll be interested to know. I know that you also worked with Larry Butler on this in a way. So what should we be on the lookout as characteristics to guide us, to mark as markers for our intervention?
Well, Larry's work is absolutely fascinating, and definitely one of the principles that I find the most useful is this matching in terms of level of resistance and reactance. And I think this is particularly relevant for people who are from a pure model perspective, that is a pure Rogerian perspective or pure cognitive behavior therapy, because in those two models, when they are applied from a treatment manual perspective, not only tells us what to do, but how to do it. So CBT, the more traditional way, tend to be more directive. The Rogerian, in the way you conduct it, tends to be more non-directive. And what the work of Larry is telling us is that, well, we should not necessarily confound the two things. We should not confound what we work on and how we work on it. And that sometimes when you're working with some individual, your Rogerian interventions might be very, very important in terms of what you're trying to do. But if you're too non-directive, the client's going to leave. And the same thing for the cognitive therapy. It might be very relevant to talk about cognitions and the need to have the persons to actually stop complaining, stop
Ruminating?
being in a rumination
Yeah.
and start doing things, right? But the way you do it, if you're too pushy and if the persons tend to be reactant, then it's not going to go anywhere, because he or she may like what you do, but it's the way of doing it, right? So it's kind of to find, I think this is a very important, and also I think it's also very important to recognize that in addition to principle, the characteristics of the client, such as being reactant or not, there's also a context, right? I always remember this client as part of the study that I was mentioning, the first study on cognitive therapy and trying to integrate ways of repairing alliance rupture. There's this client that came in, was majorly depressed, and there was this therapist, early career. She was in graduate school, extremely gifted therapist, just naturally gifted therapist. And she was following the treatment manual, and the treatment manual is you start the session by building an agenda. Okay, well, today we're going to do this and this and this and this, and one of the first thing we're going to do is whether or not you did your homework, and then we're going to be looking at, you know, what else needs to be done. And the client was saying, would spend a lot of time, half an hour, to talk about how the week was difficult, and how she was depressed, and how she was kind of angry, and or not so much angry, but more in terms like how she felt that life was very, very difficult. And I remember we were talking in supervision, and I was saying to my therapist, well, and the therapist was also saying, yeah, there's a problem. We don't do anything, right? We just kind of spend some time talking about how life is difficult. And so she came back the next session and she says, well, we got an issue here. And the issue is we don't do what we're supposed to do. And you agree that this would be good. And the client said something like, yeah, but you're the only person that I have in my life that I can talk about these things. And life is very, very tough. And I would love to have the space into my life where I can actually say something to somebody, where they don't challenge me, they just listen to me. It's so important. And I thought, wow, this is 101 psychology. And also in my life, sometimes I don't need advice. I just need somebody to hear how stressed I am. And what they did, it was really beautiful. They said, all right, so why don't we have a deal? How much time would you need? And this was not supervised. This is spontaneous. The therapist says, how much time would you need? The client says, oh, give me 20 minutes. I want to have 20 minutes. So it's less than what I do, but I want 20 minutes. And then what actually happened is fascinating. That session, she used 15. The next 10. The next 5. The next 2. Is that a client characteristics? Well, no, I think that's human beings. Human beings confronted with highly stressed situations, guess what? They just need somebody to talk with. And interestingly, 𝗔𝗹𝗲𝘅 actually is bringing up this literature that the worst thing that you can do to a human being is loneliness. Loneliness will kill more people than anything else. Right? And what she found with this therapist was supports and presence. So I think that's also something. There are some client characteristics that we can measure in terms of personality, such as what Larry is pointing out. But there's also kind of an existential issues that may be linked to personal characteristic, but that we also need to recognize. Some people need to deal with loneliness, and some people need to deal with existential issue, choices, death, etc., etc. And in that sense, this is, you can see here, I'm coming back to my old love of existential perspective, where I'm a cognitive behavior therapist, but there's something humans that is above and beyond learning principle or cognitions. About the human conditions that as a therapist we also need to pay attention when we are implementing our treatment interventions. They're not against it, but they don't necessarily emphasize it as much
Yeah.
I think in some ways, sometimes the empirically supported treatment are missing 101 of human beings. We got to be in a relationship.
So,
We just finished a chapter with a former graduate students of mine. She's on internship, so she's still students in my lab, but about how the therapeutic relationship can be therapeutic in cognitive behavior therapy, even when you don't focus directly on it. That is, even when there's no alliance rupture and alliance repaired. And one of the arguments that we actually are making is that the therapeutic relationship can be crucial because of the need of people to be attached. And that, looks so simple, but in my way, that's the next thing that cognitive behavior therapy needs to actually expose themselves to, right? Cognitive behavior therapy was first, phobic about cognitions because they were Skinnerian. So looking at the black box was bad. Cognitive changed that. Then again, influence of Marv Goldfried, cognitive behavior therapists start to recognize the emotions. And now many people are saying, yeah, emotion is crucial. Yeah, they're crucial now, but in the 70s, if you see that, people would say, this is really heresy. And here's the next one. The thing that cognitive behavior therapists, I think, are the most phobic of, it's motivations.
Is what, sorry?
Motivations. Needs. Because this is how behavior therapy was born, really, or one of it, which is Skinner saying all of these theorists, Hall and everybody else, they're talking about motivations and needs. Irrelevant. The only thing that counts is contingency. The day you start thinking about attachment is crucial, that's not a cognition, that's not a behavior, that's a need, right? And the argument that we're making in that chapter is cognitive behavior therapists needs to recognize that when people are doing something in therapy, in part they're doing it as a way to develop and to maintain a crucial aspect of human functioning, which is the attachment. And by the way, we have data about this not only in the developmental literature, we have data about this in the evolutionary science. There's a beautiful paper that was written in 1986 in Archive General Psychiatry. There's a person who said there are three things that distinguish human being from, or mammals, not only human being, all mammals from reptiles. Because as we know, we were reptiles and then we became mammal. And there are three things that all mammals do and no reptiles do. First thing is we get attached. A cat gets attached. I walk in my house and my cat is very happy. But if I had a snake, the snake wouldn't mind, wouldn't care. There's no problem. They don't need me. The second thing that we all do, all mammals do, is we communicate for the sake of communications. My cat communicates with me, not only for the food, just for the pleasure of communicating. But a rattlesnake does not communicate. A rattlesnake does not say, hey, how you doing, right? So these two elements that are crucial are directly related to an issues of relationship. To not pay attention to this is, fighting 3 million years. And by the way, the third thing that differentiates all mammals from all reptiles, playing. All mammals, my cats, dolphins, all mammals play. A rattlesnake does not play for the sake of playing. So what that means, right, is that if you're doing therapy with somebody who is depressed, you need at least to do three things. I don't care which technique that you use. You need to have the person to be at a place where he or she feels some support. And develop therapeutic relationship in the room, but also outside. You need to help the person to get one step further than that and having a way to communicate, to talk, to exchange meaningful conversations. And the third thing you need to do is you need to have that person find a way to do more than just working and to actually have fun and to play, right? And the last one is nowhere in any treatment manuals. Nowhere. Nobody says, hey, we should have this person play. I'm not saying getting positive reinforcement there. I'm saying playing for the sake of just playing.
A lot of what you're saying, it's very interesting because it comes, you know, a lot of the elements you're saying, there has been a more interest now in attachment theory, exactly, coming from all directions, and experiential therapists and psychodynamic therapists have been talking about it for a while, so it's very interesting how it all comes together in a way in your work. I would be interesting to bridge all that you said now to psychotherapy training, because you've also done some research on that. So, you know, do you believe, because I know that you train from a CBT framework and then you expand based on the principles of change, basically. Do you believe, or is it even interesting, the possibility of eventually having a pure integrative training, not school-based?
Yeah, I think it is possible. You know, like I've been talking about this, the advantage of starting from a kind of one model,
it's like a simulated,
really kind of knowing it very, very well, and also kind of then moving on, right? But I do have to say that part of this was a defense mechanism, or still a defense mechanism. That is, it's coming back to my European, or I would actually say continental roots. Portuguese, France, very different from the British. The British are very pragmatic people. French, we're not. I don't know about Portuguese, but French.
Continental philosophy.
Right. And so when I grew up, you know, as my undergrad and at my master thesis at a small university in Quebec and my master thesis in Montreal, people would just love to read those big books and just talk about these big books. You know, you read Freud. You didn't read about Freud. You read Rogers. I mean, you worked on Rogers. I mean, I read Skinner. You know, I read 𝗵𝗔𝗃𝗍. You read them, and to me, I think it kind of felt really, really kind of good. It's like pleasant. It's fun, and it's interesting, and it's meaningful. So I do need to recognize that my push or my encouragement for people to adhere to one orientation is also a reflection of this epistemological way of approaching the world, which is, hey, read, get to know them. Don't stuck to the treatment manual. Read these people. You'll see how brilliant they are and how it makes sense. But you know, the fact of the matter is, now I work in the United States, which is a more pragmatic culture, much more influenced from the other Europeans, right? The Brits, which are much more pragmatic and functional. And the US are even more functional, right? And I live in a place where not only is there a different philosophy, but people, sorry to say, they don't have time to read, right? They read emails, they read Twitters, so then I'm starting to think
cultural difference.
It's cultural, where people just basically, I don't think that they spend as much. I don't. I think I'd be shocked if I'd say to a graduate student, say, you know, why don't you just read, you know, the 3 books of Rogers, you know, and then we'll talk about it. And probably they will say, well, I don't have time to do this, right? Which, if you had said that to a French Canadian in the 1980s, a person would have replied, well, then don't be in a master thesis. That's a program. So I think in part now I'm much more open to recognizing, well, this was a bias of me. And maybe indeed another way of doing it is to start from an integrative perspective and to pay less attention to theory than I wish. And then, you know, taking aside, and maybe that's just a cultural issue. Maybe that's just a cultural or historical issue. People in the 80s, from where I came from, were reading, but that doesn't mean that this was the only way or the best way. So let's start with a integrative perspective. Wolfgang Lutz is actually making a very strong point about this.
Mm-hmm.
You could also start with the work of 𝗔𝗹𝗲𝘅, for example, who's offering a theory about this. So reading and then practicing,
Mm-hmm.
and but then I would actually then say to people, as long as this model, this integrative model, is cohesive, like the one of 𝗔𝗹𝗲𝘅, for example, and allows you, because here's the real test, right? The real test would be this. How long after 2 or 3 years of experience will it take you to come up with a case formulation and a treatment plan? That's the big advantage of actually jumping first within one orientation. As a cognitive behavior therapist, give me 3 sessions, irrespective of the client that I'm coming in, I'm going to come up with a case formulation and treatment plan.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that model, it fits well. If an integrative therapist can actually do that, right in the middle of the training, okay, well, that's good.
But it's harder.
But I think it would be harder. And I think it would be harder, and it would be also harder across cases to be cohesive, right? And then I would simply say to that person, now, if the person wants it to do, is I think there are 2 things you should be doing. Start with that, start with your integrative model, and then once you will have it mastered, when you'll feel really good about it, when you'll come up with case formulation and treatment plan rapidly, 2 things. First thing is, go back to the more traditional orientations. Go back to CBT, go back to psychodynamic therapy, go back to their manuals, and you will see that going back to those manuals, which are integrated part of your components, you will discover, oh, I can actually go more in depth with each of the components of my broad approach.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing that I would say, when you're going to become old like me, go back and read the classic.
Mm-hmm.
Go back and read Freud. Not about Freud. Go back and read Freud. So that's, by the way, that's something we do here. We have a course that is a requirement for all graduate students, first year in clinical psychology in the adult program. They take one course where the only thing that they do is they read 3 books.
Mm-hmm.
Rogers, Client-Centered Therapy, 1951. Beck, 1976, Emotional Disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third one is there is Freud, interestingly, wrote a lot of stuff, but very few things about techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And I have them to read the entire papers, technical papers that Freud ever wrote, all of them. And there are 2 comments that comes up, 2 types of comments. And the first type of comments at the end of the class is, oh my God, the content of what they say shocked me. Roger is not simple. Beck is actually so sophisticated and so humane and focusing so much on relationship and emotions. And Freud is not a wacko. And the second thing that they say is, wow, reading these guys really allowed me to have a deeper understanding of psychopathology, including my problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would say to people. If the people get into one integrative perspective,
Mm-hmm.
you should do that. But then also kind of keep in mind that one way of growing later on in their career
Mm-hmm.
is to actually going in depth in some of the components that are the pillar of their integrative approaches. And then I think, unless you are European, go back to classics. Read the classics.
Actually, you're bridging with the last question I would like to ask you, because I've been asking to all of your colleagues. I would be curious to ask you, what advice would you wish to have received when you were starting out as a psychotherapist?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. It's a very good question. Well, I think the biggest one would have been most of the training that you're going to be receiving will, by definition, if you are being trained in a program where your supervisor or faculty member, that most of the training that you will be receiving are from people who do not necessarily see a lot of clients because they have to get tenure. And I think that early on, the advice that I should have received, certainly at Stony Brook, would have been make sure that during your career, including in academia, if you go into academia, make sure that you find a way to also interact with people who mostly do clinical work. I think to me, one of the things that I'm doing now over the last 10 years, so
practice-oriented research.
Exactly. So I did a lot of things about integrations, that I did a lot of things related to the process of change in terms of my research. But over the last 10 to 15 years, I've been working with colleagues in another form of integrations, which is to try to work together and develop some research that are addressing the needs of the clinicians and are feasible. You can actually do that type of research. And that does not impose drastic change in your practice. And I think that's the advice early on that I would have liked to receive, is to say to people, I would have liked to receive the advice of, you know what, if you're going to go into academia, there are things you will not see or see enough. Mm-hmm. And, there's only 29 hours in a day. Well, there's 24, but, you always try to find more. And the only way, I think, or one of the ways that you actually could address some of your gap of knowledge is to actually do active things with clinicians. Mm-hmm. Active things. And then you will learn. And it's going to be fun. So let me give you one story that has a cultural meaning, if you're open to cultural meaning. Uh-huh. So in 1977, between 77 and 79, the Montreal Canadiens, the hockey club, had this just unbelievable season. French Canadians are good at only two things: hockey and food. That's all. And in 1997, in a long season, there were more than 80 games. Montreal Canadiens lost only 6. It was just amazing. Mm-hmm. It was, some people would say it's the best team ever. I think it's the best team ever. And they were, during that season, 77 or 79, I think it's 77, they asked the star of that team, which for French Canadian, he was the third god. First god was 𝗵cie Guichard, second 𝗵cie𝗀𝗍𝗲, and the third one was Guy Lafleur. So they asked Guy Lafleur, how was it to play for the Montreal Canadiens, the Habs, in 1977? And he said, when we went to the practice, right, we were not walking to the forum, which was the temple where they play. We were not walking to the forum for practice. We were running to the forum. And there are times when I work with clinicians, I don't walk to the meeting. I run to the meeting because, wow, I'm sitting down with these people who are so smart and they're looking at the same thing that I'm doing. But there is no competition. Zero. And what we're doing is we're just trying to figure out something that we could not do on our own. And while we're doing it, we're learning.
Mhm.
Man! And
That's
what
a
you
good
gotta
life.
do if you're French Canadian, you gotta have these meetings with food and wine.
So that's the definition of good life, right?
That's the definition of good life. There are meetings that I have regularly with two of my friends, faculty member Jeff Hayes and Ben Locke, who's a clinician, and a lot of food, a lot of wine, and the discussions about how you do psychotherapy and how you conduct psychotherapy research are the most stimulating and the most fun that I can ever have.
Mm-hmm.
So I would encourage students during their training is to actually say, there's a world out there, and find a way to get into that world outside of your training issues. Just find a way to be with that world because they're really going to help you to have fun.
Really. Louis, this was so much fun for me. Thank you so much for the opportunity.